The stench of rotting flesh mixed with cherry blossom incense filled the cramped room above the hot spring resort. 16-year-old Takemi refused the medicine that could save her life, choosing instead to let the untreated venereal disease consume her body. Death, she whispered to her friend, felt like the only escape from paradise. This account comes from recently translated testimony buried in Japanese archives for decades. But here's what will shock you. Takemi wasn't a prostitute working the streets. She was a geisha, and her story reveals a truth so disturbing that an entire industry has spent over a century covering it up. Think you know what geishas really were? Think again. The elegant artists in silk kimono that tourism brochures celebrate? That's carefully crafted mythology designed to hide systematic exploitation that would make your skin crawl. We've uncovered medical records, financial ledgers, and first-hand testimonies that reveal how thousands of young girls disappeared into a system that transformed human trafficking into high culture. The most horrifying part isn't what happened to them, it's how the world convinced itself this was beautiful. What we're about to show you will change everything you thought you knew about Japan's most mysterious tradition. Right now, millions of tourists visit Japan specifically to catch glimpses of these living cultural treasures, paying premium prices for tea ceremonies and traditional performances, never knowing they're celebrating what amounts to centuries of systematic abuse. The geisha districts of Kyoto pull in over $2 billion annually from cultural tourism, selling an image so perfectly crafted that even the survivors have stayed silent for generations. But silence has a way of breaking when someone brave enough finally decides the truth matters more than tradition. In 1957, a woman named Sayo Masuda did exactly that. And the backlash was so severe it nearly destroyed her life. She wrote her story in the only script she knew, basic hiragana characters that children learn, because she'd never been taught proper writing. The geisha house where she'd been sold as property hadn't bothered educating their merchandise beyond the bare minimum needed to entertain customers. Her autobiography became an immediate sensation in Japan, then mysteriously vanished from public discussion. Bookstores stopped stocking it. Libraries moved it to restricted sections. The geisha community launched a coordinated campaign to discredit her, claiming she was never a real geisha, that her experiences were fabricated, that she was simply a disgruntled woman seeking attention. But here's what they couldn't explain away. The medical records that corroborated her accounts, the financial documents from okia houses that matched her descriptions of debt bondage, and most damning of all, the other women who quietly began reaching out to confirm that yes, this was exactly what happened to them too. The tourism industry had spent decades building a mythology so appealing that confronting the reality underneath felt impossible. How do you tell millions of visitors that the graceful woman serving tea in her exquisite kimono might be the descendant of trafficking victims? How do you explain that those traditional dances they're watching were once performed by children who'd been sold into sexual slavery? You don't. You bury the evidence, silence the witnesses, and sell the beautiful lie instead. But Takemi's story refuses to stay buried. And what we've discovered about how she ended up in that death-soaked room will make you question everything you thought you knew about tradition, culture, and the price of beauty. Elegant, graceful, artists of the highest caliber. For centuries, the world has been fed this carefully crafted image of the geisha, the ultimate symbol of Japanese refinement and culture. But in 1957, something extraordinary happened. A woman named Sayo Masuda did the unthinkable. She broke the code of silence that had protected these secrets for generations. Writing in basic hiragana script, the only writing she knew, Masuda revealed what really happened behind those sliding doors. Her autobiography became an immediate sensation in Japan. Then mysteriously, it was buried. The geisha community denounced her. She was forced to flee her hometown. Why? What had she revealed that was so dangerous? The answer lies in documents that have been hidden for decades. To understand the horror that Masuda exposed, we need to go back, way back, to 1603, when the Tokugawa shogunate established something called the pleasure quarters, walled districts where prostitution was legal and regulated. Picture these places. Massive compounds surrounded by high walls and guarded gates, where Japan's wealthiest men came to indulge in fantasies that would have scandalized polite society. Inside these quarters worked the oiran, high-ranking courtesans who charged astronomical fees for their services. They were the celebrities of their time, dripping in gold and silk, their elaborate hairstyles requiring 8 ornamental combs worth more than most people's annual income. These women commanded prices that could bankrupt merchants, their beauty so legendary that rival lords would destroy their own fortunes competing for a single night's attention. But the oiran had assistants, young women who performed music and dance while the real business happened elsewhere. They were called geisha, literally meaning art person. Initially, these women couldn't even sit near the customers. They were background entertainment, nothing more. Forbidden from competing with their mistresses, relegated to playing shamisen in the corners, while men conducted transactions for human flesh. But something was about to change that would transform these humble assistants into something far more sinister. The merchant class was rising, growing wealthy from Japan's booming economy. But they couldn't afford oiran prices. They started looking elsewhere for entertainment, and the geishas, cheaper, more accessible, less bound by the rigid protocols of their superiors, began attracting attention. What started as background music was about to become the main event. And the consequences would echo through centuries of suffering that the tourism industry still refuses to acknowledge. The transformation had begun, and it would consume thousands of young lives in ways that make Takemi's agonizing death look merciful by comparison. By the 1800s, Japan's merchant class was growing wealthy from trade and manufacturing, but they couldn't afford the oiran's massive fees that could cost more than a year's income for a single evening. So they started gravitating toward the cheaper, more accessible geishas who offered entertainment without the astronomical price tags or elaborate protocols. This created a problem that would reshape an entire industry. The geishas were making money. Real money. And where there's money in a system built on exploitation, well, you can probably guess what happened next. But the reality was worse than anything you're imagining. The geisha houses, called okiya, realized they had struck gold buried in human misery. Young girls could be purchased from desperate families for the price of a few bags of rice. Trained in the arts just enough to justify the title, and then monetized in ways that had nothing to do with traditional entertainment anymore. The economics were brutally simple. Buy low, train cheap, sell high, and repeat until the merchandise broke down or aged out. Are you starting to see where this is heading? Because what we found in the archives will make your skin crawl. Financial ledgers from okiya houses reveal profit margins that would make modern corporations jealous, with detailed calculations of how much revenue each girl could generate before her value declined. These weren't cultural institutions preserving ancient arts. They were human trafficking operations dressed up in silk and tradition. The merchants didn't just want cheaper entertainment. They wanted something the oiran couldn't provide: complete ownership. And the okiya houses were more than happy to supply it, transforming the geisha from background musicians into a commodity so profitable that families would sell their own daughters to get a piece of the action. The transformation was complete, and the horror was just beginning. Here's what the tourism brochures won't tell you about geisha training. It began with what was essentially child trafficking, sanctioned by law and tradition. Operating with the full knowledge and approval of local authorities who collected taxes on every transaction. Families in desperate poverty would sell their daughters, some as young as 6 years old, to okiya houses, signing contracts written in language they couldn't read, agreeing to terms they didn't understand. These contracts were legally binding documents that transferred complete ownership of the child, creating debts calculated to ensure the girls could never buy their freedom before their bodies gave out from exhaustion or disease. Sayo Masuda was sold at age 12 for the equivalent of what her family owed in back rent. Her autobiography reveals the moment her uncle retrieved her from the farming family where she worked as a nursemaid, telling her they were going on a short trip to visit relatives in the mountains. She thought she was finally going home to see her mother. Instead, she was taken to the Takanoya geisha house in Suwa, Nagano, where her uncle collected his payment and disappeared forever. The other geishas immediately gave her a nickname, Low, mocking her sunburned skin and complete lack of education. She was illiterate, had never worn proper shoes, spoke in a rural dialect that marked her as peasant trash, and lifted one leg to warm it against the other during winter. A survival technique that earned her another cruel nickname, Crane. The house mother explained the rules with brutal clarity. Masuda now belonged to them completely. Her debt would grow daily to cover food, shelter, training, and interest, and any attempt to run away would result in her family losing their farm and facing criminal charges for breach of contract. But the psychological abuse was just the beginning of a systematic breaking process designed to transform children into compliant entertainment machines who would accept any degradation as normal. What happened next contradicts everything you've been told about geisha apprenticeship. These weren't students in an art school learning traditional arts from patient masters. They were prisoners in a system designed to break their will completely, using techniques that would be recognized today as systematic psychological torture. Masuda's testimony reveals the daily reality that tourism guides never mention. Inadequate food calculated to keep the girls weak and compliant, freezing sleeping quarters with threadbare blankets that left them shivering through winter nights, and constant physical punishment for infractions as minor as humming the wrong tune or holding chopsticks incorrectly. The house mother ruled through terror, using bamboo switches to beat girls who moved too slowly, withheld meals from anyone who showed defiance, and forced them to practice dance routines until their feet bled through their thin socks. When Masuda defended her friend Karuta during one of these brutal sessions, she was thrown down the wooden stairs, her body tumbling and cracking until her right leg snapped with a sound the other girls would never forget. While recovering in the hospital, where she finally learned her real name had been changed on the house registry to make tracking runaways more difficult, she and Karuta planned a suicide pact that revealed just how desperate these children had become. They actually made it to the train tracks on a moonless night, Karuta carrying the injured Masuda on her back through the snow, both of them crying as they waited for the late freight train that would end their suffering. They stood there on the cold metal rails, holding hands and whispering goodbye, convinced that death was their only escape from a life that had become unbearable torture. But something stopped them at the last moment. Not hope, not rescue, but the terrible realization that their deaths would only result in their families being charged for breach of contract. And that decision to live would lead to revelations that make their planned suicide look merciful by comparison. Can you imagine being so desperate that death seems like the better option? That was just Tuesday in a geisha house, and the horror was only beginning. Layers of romantic mythology and carefully curated photo opportunities. Not all geishas were the same. Despite what the postcards and travel guides suggest, there was a hierarchy. And newly discovered records from police raids and medical examinations reveal categories of exploitation that will shock you to your core. There were the machi geisha, who officially didn't sleep with customers and maintained the artistic facade that modern tourism celebrates. Then there were the kuruwa geisha, who did both entertainment and sex work, performing traditional dances before retiring to private rooms for services that had nothing to do with cultural preservation. And finally, what Masuda called the sleep with anyone geisha. Girls who had been completely broken by the system and would submit to any demand from any customer willing to pay the house fee. But here's the disturbing truth hidden in the archives that no cultural center will ever acknowledge. Which category you fell into wasn't your choice, wasn't based on talent or artistic ability, wasn't determined by your dedication to preserving traditional arts. It was calculated with brutal efficiency based on your debt level, your physical appearance, your compliance with house rules, and, most chillingly, your age when you entered the system, and how much training your spirit could withstand before snapping completely. The younger you were when sold, the more likely you'd end up in the bottom tier. Your childhood systematically destroyed to create maximum profit for the Okiya. Financial records show house mothers keeping detailed charts tracking each girl's progress through the categories, noting which ones could be pushed further down the hierarchy when their debts grew too large or their bodies showed too much wear from the work. And we haven't even gotten to the mizuage ritual yet, The virginity auctions that funded this entire system of exploitation. That's coming up next. And it's worse than anything Hollywood has ever depicted, because the reality involved children who had no idea what was being sold until it was too late to resist. Remember Takemi from our opening, lying in that incense-soaked room, her body consumed by untreated gonorrhea as she refused the medicine that could save her life. She wasn't an isolated case. She was the inevitable result of a systematic health crisis that the geisha community covered up for generations to protect their profitable fiction. Masuda's autobiography documents the medical nightmare that no tourism brochure mentions. Venereal disease running rampant through the houses like wildfire, spreading from customer to customer in an endless cycle of infection that the Okia treated as just another cost of doing business. Medical care was either completely non-existent or deliberately withheld as punishment, with house mothers calculating whether treating a sick girl cost more than simply replacing her with fresh merchandise from the countryside. Masuda describes in horrifying detail watching women slowly die from preventable conditions, their bodies ravaged by syphilis and gonorrhea that ate through their organs while they continued performing for customers who demanded their services regardless of visible symptoms. She witnessed girls developing open sores that never healed, losing their hair in clumps, bleeding internally until they collapsed during dance performances, their minds deteriorating from neurological damage that could have been prevented with basic medical intervention. But seeking medical care meant admitting what they were really doing behind those sliding doors decorated with cherry blossoms and traditional paintings. It meant acknowledging that these celebrated artists were actually sex workers with no legal protections, no labor rights, no recourse when their bodies broke down from the systematic abuse disguised as cultural tradition. The houses preferred to let them die in agonizing silence rather than admit the truth that would destroy their carefully constructed mythology. Takemi made the rational choice. She chose to speed up her own death rather than continue living in agony that would only worsen with each passing day. She saw dying as liberation from a system that viewed her suffering as acceptable collateral damage. And this was just the beginning of what these women endured in the name of preserving traditional culture that was actually industrialized human exploitation. Now we reach the most disturbing revelation of all. The one that exposes the entire geisha mythology as a carefully constructed lie designed to hide crimes against children. The mizuage ceremony. The ritual that Arthur Golden sensationalized in Memoirs of a Geisha as a romantic coming-of-age tradition was real, but the reality was infinitely worse than any fiction could depict. Young girls, some barely 13 years old, had their virginity auctioned to the highest bidder in ceremonies that were nothing more than legalized child rape disguised as cultural tradition. The money from these auctions went directly to the Okia to pay down fabricated debts that had been deliberately inflated to justify the sale, while the girls received nothing except trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their shortened lives. But here's what Golden's novel didn't tell you, and what the tourism industry still refuses to acknowledge even today. This wasn't a rare, ceremonial occurrence reserved for special occasions or exceptional circumstances. In houses like Masuda's, it was routine business practice, happening multiple times per year as new girls reached the age where their virginity could command premium prices from wealthy customers who specifically sought out children for their twisted fantasies. Masuda's records show that after mizuage, these girls were expected to continue providing sexual services as part of their regular artistic duties, with the house mother maintaining detailed schedules of which customers preferred which girls and how much they were willing to pay for specific acts that had nothing to do with traditional entertainment. The line between geisha and prostitute didn't just blur in these establishments. It disappeared entirely, revealing that the cultural preservation narrative was simply marketing designed to make child sexual exploitation palatable to a society that wanted to believe in beautiful traditions. This wasn't culture, this wasn't art, this wasn't the preservation of ancient customs. This was systematic sexual exploitation of children, dressed up in silk kimono and traditional makeup to disguise the horror underneath. The mizuage ceremony was child trafficking with ceremonial ribbons, and every tourist dollar spent celebrating geisha culture today helps fund the mythology that keeps these crimes buried in archives where most people will never see the truth. World War II didn't create these horrors, it simply stripped away the careful facades that had hidden them from public view for centuries. exposing the brutality that had always existed beneath the silken ceremony. As Japan mobilized for total war, dedicating every resource to the military effort, the luxury entertainment districts became impossible to maintain under their traditional pretenses. Geisha districts were officially ordered closed in 1944 as part of the National Mobilization Decree, with many geishas conscripted into factory work producing munitions and military supplies, alongside other women deemed non-essential to the war effort. But some okiya houses found more creative solutions that revealed just how adaptable their exploitation systems really were. They moved their operations to remote hot spring resorts in mountainous regions, far from military oversight and government inspection, where they could continue their profitable activities under the guise of providing rest and relaxation for exhausted war workers and military personnel on leave. This is where Masuda's story becomes even darker, if such a thing is possible. These resort geishas worked under conditions that made the traditional urban houses look like luxury hotels by comparison. There was no pretense of art training, no elaborate kimono ceremonies, no cultural education whatsoever. Just pure, undisguised sexual exploitation operating 24 hours a day, with customers who had been brutalized by war and took out their trauma on the most vulnerable targets available. The girls had no protection from military police who were often customers themselves. No recourse when soldiers became violent. No medical care when the inevitable diseases and injuries accumulated from the constant abuse. American soldiers arriving after Japan's surrender encountered women throughout the occupied territories, claiming to be geisha girls. But most of these were actually prostitutes using the geisha brand to attract Western customers who had romanticized notions about Japanese culture, while the real geishas from the traditional houses were either dead from disease and violence, had disappeared into the general population to escape their past, or were too physically and psychologically traumatized to continue working in any capacity. The war had torn away the beautiful mythology and revealed the industrial-scale human trafficking underneath. But instead of leading to justice or acknowledgement, it created the perfect opportunity for the ultimate cover-up. The worst part wasn't what had happened during the war. It was what happened next, as an entire culture conspired to bury the evidence and rebuild the beautiful lie. When Sayo Masuda published her autobiography in 1957, she shattered a conspiracy that had protected these secrets for centuries, threatening to destroy an entire industry built on carefully maintained lies about cultural preservation and artistic tradition. The response was swift and brutal, coordinated across multiple institutions with the precision of a military operation designed to destroy her credibility before her revelations could spread beyond Japan's borders. The geisha community denounced her as a liar and fraud, claiming her experiences were fabricated fantasies designed to sensationalize and profit from exotic Western fascination with Japanese culture. Traditional okiya houses launched a coordinated campaign insisting she wasn't a real geisha at all, just a common prostitute who had appropriated their sacred traditions to legitimize her sordid past and gain sympathy from gullible readers. Cultural historians dismissed her detailed accounts as gross exaggerations, arguing that she had conflated different time periods and misunderstood the sophisticated artistic training that authentic geisha houses provided to their carefully selected apprentices. Publishers were pressured to remove her book from circulation, bookstores stopped stocking it, and libraries moved it to restricted collections, where curious readers would need special permission to access the dangerous truth it contained. She was systematically ostracized from her community, receiving death threats that forced her to relocate multiple times, always moving to smaller towns where her notoriety hadn't yet reached the local population. Why such a violent reaction to one woman's story about events that had supposedly happened decades earlier? Because Masuda had violated the fundamental rule that had protected the geisha world since its inception. Absolute silence about what really happened behind those sliding doors, decorated with scenes of natural beauty and traditional poetry. But here's what they couldn't silence, despite their coordinated efforts to discredit and destroy her: the documentary evidence that investigators began uncovering once her testimony provided a roadmap to the hidden archives. Medical records from rural hospitals documenting venereal disease outbreaks in geisha districts police reports describing raids on suspected brothels operating under cultural licenses, financial ledgers from okia houses showing profit margins that could only be sustained through systematic exploitation, all confirming that Masuda's horror story was just one thread in a vast tapestry of institutional abuse that had operated for generations. And then something even more disturbing emerged from the archives that would prove the cover-up was still ongoing, still actively protecting perpetrators who were very much alive and very much invested in keeping their crimes buried forever. In 1997, Arthur Golden published Memoirs of a Geisha, supposedly based on extensive interviews with real geishas who had agreed to share their authentic experiences with Western audiences hungry for exotic cultural insights. The book became a global phenomenon, selling millions of copies and cementing the romantic mythology of geishas as elegant artists whose dedication to traditional culture represented the pinnacle of Japanese refinement and spiritual beauty. Hollywood adapted it into a major motion picture. Tourism to Japan's geisha districts exploded, and the world fell in love with an image that seemed to validate everything people wanted to believe about the mysterious East. But there was a problem that would expose the entire modern mythology machine in the most ironic way possible. Mineko Iwasaki, Golden's primary source and the most famous geisha of the 20th century, sued him for defamation and breach of contract, claiming he had completely betrayed their confidential interviews. Why would she sue someone for writing a book that celebrated geisha culture and brought international attention to traditional Japanese arts? Because Golden had taken her stories of legitimate artistic training, rigorous cultural education, and respected entertainment work, then twisted them into a prostitution narrative filled with sexual exploitation and mizuage ceremonies to sell more books to Western audiences who expected exotic Oriental sensuality rather than actual cultural preservation. Here's the truly disturbing irony that reveals how thoroughly the cover-up had succeeded. In trying to sensationalize geisha culture for Western audiences, Golden accidentally revealed truths about sexual exploitation that the industry had spent decades covering up. But he applied those truths to the wrong tier of the system. The lawsuit exposed something horrifying that neither Golden nor Iwasaki fully understood. There were actually two completely different worlds operating under the geisha label, existing simultaneously but carefully separated to maintain plausible deniability. The high-class artistic entertainers in prestigious districts like Gion represented everything Iwasaki claimed about legitimate cultural preservation, while the systematic sexual exploitation that Golden described was happening in hot spring resorts and lower-tier houses where women like Masuda suffered in complete invisibility. And guess which story the tourism industry chose to promote after the lawsuit settled and the controversy died down? They took Golden's romanticized version, stripped out the sexual exploitation that had made Iwasaki sue, and created the perfect marketing narrative that acknowledged historical suffering while claiming it had all been eliminated by modern reforms and cultural evolution. Let's talk numbers, because they tell a story that's impossible to deny, even when every cultural institution in Japan wants you to ignore the mathematical reality of what happened to tens of thousands of women who simply vanished from the historic record. In the 1920s, there were 80 geishas registered across Japan, working in districts from major cities to remote mountain towns, generating revenue that supported entire regional economies built on their systematic exploitation. By the late 20th century, fewer than 10 remained in the entire country, concentrated almost exclusively in Kyoto's tourist districts where their activities could be carefully monitored and their stories controlled. Where did 79 women go in the span of just a few decades? The official explanation is comfortingly vague. Some married and left the profession. Some aged out and retired to run restaurants or tea houses. Some simply chose different careers as Japan modernized and women gained more opportunities. But Masuda's records and similar testimonies from the few survivors willing to speak suggest a far darker reality. Thousands simply disappeared. Victims of disease that was never treated, suicide that was never investigated, or abandonment when they were no longer profitable and became liabilities that houses wanted to eliminate quietly. The economics are chilling in their brutal efficiency. and reveal the true scale of this human trafficking operation disguised as cultural preservation. A young girl could be purchased from her desperate family for the equivalent of a few $100s, often during famines or economic disasters when parents faced choosing between selling a daughter or watching their entire family starve. After years of training, that was actually systematic abuse designed to break their resistance. Each girl would generate thousands of dollars in revenue annually through entertainment fees, private services, and special ceremonies that had nothing to do with traditional arts. If she survived long enough to become profitable, the Okiya owned her completely, through debt structures that grew faster than she could possibly repay, ensuring decades of unpaid labor disguised as artistic apprenticeship. If she didn't survive the training, the disease, the violence, or the psychological torture, well, there were always more desperate families willing to sell their daughters, creating an endless supply chain of human misery that operated with complete legal protection under the banner of cultural tradition. This wasn't culture, this wasn't art, this wasn't the preservation of ancient wisdom. This was human trafficking on an industrial scale that consumed nearly 80 lives while the world applauded its beautiful traditions. Today, fewer than 1 legitimate geishas work in Japan, mostly in Kyoto's carefully regulated traditional districts where they follow strict artistic training protocols, live in monitored houses with transparent financial arrangements, and maintain the cultural traditions that millions of tourists pay premium prices to witness in person. These modern geishas represent everything the tourism industry wants you to believe the profession always was. Dedicated artists preserving ancient culture through rigorous study of dance, music, and traditional hospitality that requires years of disciplined training to master. But speak to anthropologists who've spent decades studying the historical records that most people never see, and you'll hear a very different story that reveals how thoroughly the modern sanitized version obscures the systematic horror that came before. They've found evidence scattered across archives in dozens of prefectures, proving that the exploitation Masuda described wasn't aberrant behavior by a few corrupt houses. It was systematic across multiple regions and time periods, operating with such consistency that it clearly represented standard business practices rather than isolated criminal activity. Recently discovered police records from the 1930s and 1940s document routine raids on geisha houses suspected of prostitution, with officers noting that they found exactly what they expected to find, but rarely pressed charges because the distinction between legal entertainment and illegal sex work had been deliberately blurred by regulations designed to protect profitable businesses rather than vulnerable women. Medical surveys from the same period reveal widespread venereal disease in geisha districts at rates far higher than the general population, with detailed documentation of symptoms that could only result from systematic sexual exploitation disguised as cultural activities. Financial ledgers recovered from bankrupt Okiya houses show debt structures specifically designed to ensure women could never buy their freedom, with interest rates and living expenses calculated to grow faster than any amount of entertainment work could possibly repay, creating permanent bondage that lasted until death or complete physical breakdown. The survivors who are still alive today, the women who lived through this system and escaped to tell about it, most refuse to speak publicly about their experiences, even to family members who have never learned the truth about their grandmothers' or great-grandmothers' lives in the houses. The code of silence that Masuda violated when she published her autobiography still holds tremendous power today, enforced not just by social pressure, but by legal threats and economic retaliation against anyone who dares to contradict the beautiful mythology that generates billions in tourism revenue. Which brings us to the most disturbing question of all, the one that reveals why this cover-up continues to this day, and why the truth about 79 disappeared. Women remains buried in archives that most people will never access. Sayo Masuda died in 2008, largely forgotten by the world that had rejected her truth and moved on to more comfortable narratives about cultural preservation and artistic tradition, her testimony buried beneath decades of carefully constructed mythology that transformed industrial-scale human trafficking into romantic tourism opportunities. But her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, tradition, and complicity that extend far beyond Japan's borders and challenge everything we think we know about how civilized societies function when profit and cultural pride are at stake. How does an entire culture conspire to hide systematic abuse that operated for centuries in plain sight? How do we transform exploitation into exotic mystique that attracts millions of visitors eager to experience the beauty of traditions built on human suffering? How do we convince ourselves that suffering is beautiful when it's wrapped in silk, kimono, and traditional ceremony, when the evidence of that suffering is documented in archives that most people will never bother to examine? The geisha system wasn't unique in human history. It was just uniquely successful at marketing itself to the modern world as something worth celebrating rather than condemning. Across history and cultures, we see the same pattern repeating with depressing consistency. Vulnerable people, systematically exploited by those with power. Their suffering romanticized and repackaged by those who benefit from maintaining the mythology that makes the exploitation seem acceptable or even admirable. Today, as Japan markets its geisha heritage to millions of tourists who spend billions of dollars celebrating what they believe represents the pinnacle of cultural refinement, Masuda's testimony stands as a haunting reminder of what lies beneath the surface of traditions that seem too beautiful to question. Behind every cultural treasure that seems too good to be true, behind every ancient tradition that conveniently generates massive tourism revenue, there are often women like Takemi, dying in agony while choosing death over life, because the reality was too horrible to endure, and no one with power cared enough to intervene. The real secret life of Japanese geishas isn't about grace and artistry, dedication to traditional culture, or the preservation of ancient wisdom. It's about power, systematic exploitation, and the dangerous human capacity to transform suffering into something we can admire from a safe distance while ignoring the voices of those who tried to tell us the truth. The next time you see a graceful geisha in a tourism advertisement, remember Sayo Masuda, who died alone and forgotten. Remember Takemi, who chose death as liberation. Remember the 79 women who disappeared from the statistics while the world applauded their beautiful traditions. Because the most horrifying part of this story isn't what happened to them in those houses of systematic abuse. It's how easily we've forgotten their suffering and how willingly we continue to celebrate the mythology that erased their voices from history.